You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson.
I'm your co-host, Matthew.
And thank you for joining me this week, Matthew, after a long absence. And welcome for the first time to the podcast, FuriusPertinax. He's a historian. Well, that's what he's usually known for. That's what a lot of his commentary revolves around. He has a very in-depth knowledge of ancient history as well as what the world wars. But that's not what we've got him here today to talk about. We've actually got him here today to talk about his profession, which is farming. Now, farming is a big part of Australian identity. It's sort of synonymous with a large part of our history. The convicts came here, they were awarded large land grants, and they went out and they cultivated this land and made it into usable pastures that powered Australia for many decades to come. Now, that has sort of changed in recent times, and we've got Furius here to talk a little bit about it from a first-hand perspective. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, listeners. I'm actually quite pleased to be invited. I haven't been on before, and obviously a lot of content in our spheres tends to be sort of like international in terms of there's obviously a lot of clout amongst Americans and a lot of Brits, I suppose, in like this sort of dissident right sphere. And it's very heartening to see that there are a good bunch of Aussies getting on top of it too. So pleasure to be here, guys, and I'm very flattered and very grateful for the welcome.
Yeah,
so no speaking German this episode then? We'll cut that out. That'll be next week.
Yeah, we're editing that out this time round. Sorry, okay. Matthew. So we'll dive right into it. Recently, Furious, I was watching Jeremy Clarkson's Farm, basically, the TV show, and the season 3 just recently came out. Now, I was watching that, and it was quite interesting because he really goes into the nitty-gritty of some of the difficulties surrounding being a farmer in the modern, well, I suppose it's across the West, but specifically in Britain, in England, where he lives. Now, it seems to reflect a lot of the problems that are unfolding, not just in Britain, but here and America and the rest of the Anglosphere. We've seen a decline. It's almost like a managed decline of our agricultural industry as a whole, and the sort of rise of multinational giant companies taking over this role. In fact, I was even listening to one promo for the TV show, and Jeremy Clarkson, he actually, funnily enough, he says, it's almost like, he said, some people have described this as a sort of ethnic cleansing of farmers. And that's very powerful language, something that he even acknowledges. But it's definitely hard to ignore the parallels, the sort of managed diminishment of agriculture as an industry and farmers themselves. Our regions have hollowed out, especially in Australia, something that you might be able to give testament to. And I think that it's a great shame. I think that's a very sad thing because you go to these old country towns and you drive out of the cities and into the regions, and these are the areas where you seem to, well, I feel most in contact with traditional Australia and with Australian history. I feel like it's the only place where a sort of Australian identity and organic manifestation of Australian identity still persists. So I think it's a great shame to see our agricultural industry and these towns that are built around it and the regions as a whole diminished as a result. But maybe you can talk about it. Are my inclinations correct, like my what I've just said, or am I completely off the mark?
No, I think you're quite correct. In fact, I'd almost say that I know this sounds like a bit of a mean thing to say, and I don't mean to get your listeners offside by saying this, but I've kind of long suggested that the great tragedy of Australia is that I sometimes question the ability of Australia to be saved by its own people, by Australians, and by that I don't mean people like us. I mean this because Australia has undergone a massive transformation, in recent decades. I'm not too sure how old you fellas are. I'm sort of like in my mid-30s, so I've seen a lot of transformation, from basically throughout the 90s and onwards. And even in that very short space of time, there has been an evisceration, essentially, of the regional areas. And whether you're talking about rural Queensland or rural New South Wales, country Victoria, country WA. It's a continual story that could be sort of echoed in every corner of the country, and it's almost the same, in 99% of places. And I think, it's not those people who are doing this. It is the work of, those who sit in our various state capitals and it is the work of the Canberra elite. It's our politicians. It's our politicians' paymasters. It's lobby groups and activists who have clout in the halls of power, and it's also corporations and XYZ, all these sort of how can we say vectors of power that exist in sort of any Western country that happen to be particularly perfidious in the Anglosphere. And they're the ones who are orchestrating policy that are accelerating this process. And even in my own relatively short lifetime, I've sort of seen massive transformation of country towns. I mean, I still remember as a boy, right, seeing lines of trucks going to wheat bins, to what you might call almost more a settlement than a town. They're sort of like dotted along the railway, but they got a delivery bin, like a wheat bin, or they could take barley or whatever. They'll have a pub, they'll post office, a school, and a handful of houses, and that's a little sort of town. And they existed even in the late 80s, early 90s. Within 10 years, probably the majority of those kind of towns that existed vanished. The infrastructure vanished, the people left, all you were left with were ghost towns. And then that started happening to slightly larger towns across the board. And then, with the exception of towns that actually had, so like larger country towns that sort of have, educational infrastructure, they might have, like a high school, or they might have, like comprehensive sport facilities, or they'll have, like a couple of mechanics and, the kind of service industries that sort of support a community at the regional level. Those sort of towns kind of got by okay. But anything that was a satellite town that didn't have much in the way of, so like its own light industry or its like little commercial sector that was self-sustaining, those kind of towns throughout the 90s and through the noughties have basically vanished. And what kind of saddens me is that there is an instinct amongst people too, this is happening to, that they understand something is awry. They feel something's wrong. They know something's wrong. Just sadly that, and I don't obviously say this in a in like a pejorative or condescending fashion, but most country people aren't, shall I say, intellectually inclined, and might struggle to articulate their feelings or concerns, in a way that sort of comes across to other social strata in like in a given society or country, and so have been frustrated. And then, as always, there's always, as often happens in these instances, there's this sort of pseudo-intellectual, sort of journalistic academic elite who will sneer at country people for their concerns. Oh, like you're just a bumpkin, or you're just a, you're a hayseed, or you're just a bumpkin. You don't understand. There's all these economic complexities and yada 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 and social dynamics and whatever. And so I feel the country people haven't been able to particularly advocate their cause out well. And on top of that, there has been policy after policy. There has been sort of mismanagement after mismanagement. There's sort of, in concert with some climatic factors, which isn't to sort of suggest climate change. I'm just saying that there are variances in climate that occur that have, brought tough times. There's been the East Coast droughts in the, early mid noughties. In the West, they had them sort of in the late noughties and into the early 2010s, and then interdispersed between them, like Queensland and northern New South Wales have had a couple of massive flooding episodes in the last 15 years. And this brings complete ruin to whole swaths of countryside. Entire bodies of livestock, are destroyed, and crops and houses and infrastructure and all this stuff just goes to the wayside. Meanwhile, there happens to be bundles of money for pet projects, in Canberra, and for the leeches that come out of Canberra, and for this body and for that body, and there seems to be limitless money to send to to foreign aid, and there's this program in Indonesia or that program in Malaysia, and this much money goes to India, and this much money goes to Africa and whatever. And we have so much sufferance in our own country, and particularly the agricultural sector. It is such, and you rightly said at the start of the show, that we have this this history that Australia, it's the old phrase, the Australian economy sort of rests on the back of the of the sheep, essentially. And I mean, for many decades that was true, and if not literally the back of the sheep, it's an allegory for the agricultural sector. It's grain, it's livestock, it's produce, it's viticulture, it's fruit and veg, that sort of stuff, right? A lot of it's lucrative, and also that probably includes fishing to some degree. But, for all of that output, for all that production and productivity, we don't have anywhere near the kind of support that particularly like the Europeans get and certain for sectors of the American industry get. And there's this like ambivalence towards agriculture, even though, and again, there's another point that you raised, that sort of the country Australian, this sort of Australian frontiersman, the bushman, the sort of the Ned Kelly kind of archetype. Well, not by me as a bushranger, but like that sort of frontier Banjo Patterson type archetype that was sort of the Burke and Wills types that pushed into the harsh frontier and made something from nothing. Because Australia is a harsh continent. This is a tough place to get along, by and large. And Australian farmers have been extraordinarily tough and adaptive, and they've been masters of improvisation and have been have had to be patient and diligent to make something of this land. And really the powers that be have just sort of left them to wither on the vine, and I think that's a great tragedy. I'm aware I'm monologuing, so I'll let you guys come back in, but I hope that kind of is an introduction, I suppose, to the topic.
No, that's 100% spot on, because you see all across every state government, the federal government, like in Queensland, you had regions that had a drought for over 12 years, and the Queensland government's going there, closing down education services, facilities, healthcare facilities, and moving them out. And then how do you expect regions to grow? It is a not coordinated, but it is a widespread idea, concept, notion within the elite that, these bumpkins, there's only 10,000 of them in that town. We don't need to spend money out there. We don't need to keep up services. We don't need to look after them. There are these coastal cities, all these immigrants coming in. We need to look after them, which is a great shame. There's a lot of history, culture, identity in these regions that is being lost when people have to move away. There's decades of drought. There's no support. They have to move their family, and that's just, that part of Australia is lost, and it's happened for decades, and it's a great shame. You got Country Women's Association, you got men's clubs, all these where it's just 80-year-old men, 70-year-old women, all this knowledge, skills, history, culture that is not getting passed to the next generation, because there is no next generation out there. And it's just this transatlantic kind of culture in the eastern coast, in Perth, that all the kids are growing up with. They aren't being told these fables of Australians, of Leichhardt and Parkes and all these great Australians that we used to back in the day, decades gone by. Now we're getting, drag time, story hour and whatnot. So there's a massive part of Australian life that has been lost. But do you think it can come back, Furious?
Well, the thing is, in a meta context, like in a civilizational context, I'm something of a positivist, because the thing is, the forces of entropy end up decaying itself, and I'm quite a fan of what we call the cyclical historians, or the people who engage or agree with the concept of cyclical history. So you're talking people like Gobineau, Toynbee, to some degree Evola fits into that category, Oswald Spengler, and I'm a person relatively versed in history. I mean, I before we jumped on here, I sort of shared with you some of my work, and I mean, I've done two extensive playlists. Pardon me. One discussing like the nations of Charlemagne, which basically encompasses the history of Italy, of France, of Germany, and another one being orthodoxy, autocracy, nationalism, which is essentially the history of Greeks and the Orthodox Church and the Eastern, Mediterranean, the Eastern European people. So Greeks and Bulgarians and Russians and stuff, and a lot of research went into that. And I kind of always had this hankering that this was true anyway. But a lot of this research really sort of brings up time and again that these meta cycles exist, and one of the great examples I bring to light is actually, this will kind of please you guys. I went to Turkey for the 100th anniversary of Gallipoli, and we did like a tour of Anatolia, which is like the Asiatic part of Turkey, the main part of the country, and and I went to the Anatolian Civilization Museum, which is actually in Ankara, because we're there for like 2 days, and they had the writing system that the East used to use, like before, like the invention of like Greek and hieroglyphics and stuff, was called cuneiform, and they sort of like with a essentially like a reed pen, they'd sort of in wet clay, they'd make these tablets in their in what was a very old writing form, and then those clay tablets would go into essentially like a kiln or like a furnace, and they'd be baked and then sent off as like tablets, and in the same way that our predecessors would have used letters like in the last 100 years or so, or telegrams. And one of the most moving examples of a tablet was that there was one written by a prince of a city. It's been destroyed since the Bronze Age, but a city called I think it was called Ugarit, which is sort of like in what is today sort of like the border between Lebanon and Syria on the sort of East Mediterranean coastline. And his father ventured to like an ally to try and get help. This is during the Bronze Age collapse, and the message was saying, "Father, the sea people are here. I don't have enough troops to hold the town," or like something to that effect. But they found the tablet in the furnace, which implies that the message didn't get out, that the sack of the city happened so quickly that after the message was written, the message was never dispatched. And for the people that lived in Ugarit, it was the end of their world. It was the end of their civilization. But what happens at the end of the Bronze Age is that we enter the Iron Age, and there's the fall of the Mitanni, for instance, and the fall of the the early Phoenician city-states. But then the Phoenician city-states kind of come back out of this dark age. The Mitanni are replaced by the Assyrians. The Hittites fall and are replaced by the Lydians, who are not necessarily the same people, but they're kind of like a variation of a very similar group. So in the ashes of one civilization collapsing, another rises up from like a phoenix. And I know we live in a very different world, and that's kind of the great challenge people like us have, is knowing what might actually happen in the context of collapse. But like this cycle happens over and over again. And if you really delve into history and you're really you're a person who's interested in history, in one sense it's imposing and it's possibly a bit frightening, but on the other hand there is hope. One thing I often say to more Christian or people inclined towards Christianity, or really devout Catholics and whatever, is just like, if you were to live during the times of the fall of Rome, or you were a resident in Constantinople when the Turks took the city in 1453, the world as you knew it ended, and it would have been a horrific thing to have experienced. But the world outside of that went on. There was a future of some kind. Sorry, I'm taking a long time to answer your question, but I think in terms of European civilization, I think we do have a substantive chance, because particularly in like this, what we live in, like this liberal progressive fantasy land that is built upon fiction and lies. Because whenever someone who adheres to liberalism tells you that, oh, they believe in truth and facts and science, like, no, you dismiss the very first example of that, which is human nature and natural law. If you, for instance, believe that people are born the same and born equal, you are lying. You are either too stupid to know the difference, or you are intellectualizing a lie, because tabula rasa is false. Tabula rasa is a product of the French Revolution. It is not factual in any way. And so, sorry, I kind of went on a tangent there, but in essence, I think at the civilizational level, people like us realize that there is a way forward, and that this entropic force of leftism basically will implode on itself. It's almost inevitable. People might be familiar with the term bio-Leninism. The left end up creating such a degenerative state, because they are the weakest people. They degenerate the fastest, as does their system. So that's hopeful. My concern about Australia specifically, to get to your question, in a specific sense, is that I think, and I hate to say this, I say this as a very proud and patriotic Australian who's waved this flag for a very long time, is that Australian people, maybe not us, maybe not people who think like us, but the predominant majority of the both the urban elites and the urban classes who depend on the system that is established by urban elites, right? Have had it too good for too long. They believe too many of the lies and of the false premises and the false presuppositions established by our system. And for instance, if and when Europe suffers a setback or a collapse, Italy's next to France, Germany's next to Poland, Slovakia is next to Hungary. You're in proximate, you're in like this proximity to people who are maybe different from you, but relatively similar. Our great peril is that we are a great southern land, and our two of our 3 or 4 closest countries are Indonesia and China. We're a long way from the homeland, in this case being Mother Britain. We're a long way from our closest ally, which is America. And we are a highly urbanized society, of which I believe 92 or 94% of Australians live literally in the capital cities of the states. And if our systems crumble in terms of urban decay, we really don't have a plan B. So I'm sorry to sort of offer a bit of a black pill there, but I think it's tough. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's very tough.
I think in response to that, you bring up this point of the leftists and all these progressives, decaying a lot quicker, and a lot of them aren't having children, and you see a lot more, these young Catholic, young Christian families, privately educated, going to university, work, get wealthier over periods. Do you see kind of a shifting in the elite, and will this help this divide between urban and rural people, if there is a change in the elite to a more Christian and less internationalist?
I think that's where the great chance lies, right? It's funny you should sort of bring up that example, because I think if there's a window of opportunity for success, it will be there. But people of a patriotic traditionalist, not everyone's going to be a Christian, obviously, but for those who adhere to either like traditional Protestantism or Lutheranism or Catholicism, or even like the Ortho Bros, whatever. Like in the end, I think we're done with the infighting, because we all have far greater external enemies to worry about, right? So I'll use the term Christian collectively in that sense. And then there are probably some people who are non-religious who probably feel the same way. But people generally of our ilk who sort of have that traditionalistic and patriotic bent to us, we, I think, have to coalesce in places of strength. And this is where I used to be laughed at this point when I was saying this amongst, shall we say, our political circles 10 years ago, is that the idea of parallelism is not so much that you're fighting over the same turf. It's not like a turf war in the same way you might you'd imagine like the 5 families of New York, like the mafia sort of fighting over districts of, Brooklyn or Queens or something. You're not fighting over that. That's not what the parallelism means. The parallelism means that kind of a bit like what the South Africans are doing with Oriana, creating their own community in South Africa, even in the context of being governed by the ANC, and essentially having a government that considers white Africans a hostile entity within South Africa. Even though the entire political and physical and economic and cultural infrastructure of South Africa was basically built by the settler, and settler-descended population, if you get my meaning. That they're doing that in Oriana. And I think for us, our opportunity lies in the context of, hey, listen, there are these country towns that are declining, that are becoming ghost towns. My concept in my mind is that essentially right-wing people, and if, listen, it means to take a haircut on their salary, so be it. It means if they have to undersell their house for maybe, a few $1,000s, so be it. If they have to sell one of your extra cars, so be it. In the end, in tough times, we all have to make, have a haircut at some point, and we have to make some kind of sacrifices. But these people would be better served going to rural areas and dominating the parent committee boards of the local school, re-engaging with the church groups, filling the pews again, engaging community service, and actually start to rejuvenate these long atrophied and not atrophied in the context of like the leftist thing of like purposefully atrophying things. What we've seen is just the country areas have gone grey because all the young people have come to the city being sold false promise, right? So I think people should return to the country. People who are, I literally mean like people who are doctors and lawyers and, professionals and whatever, should take their money and their resources and go to these places, like amongst friends. Like literally, if sort of, let's say I'm talking like to a bunch of dads here. Say there's 10 of you who feel this way. Take your 10 families and pick a town and buy houses on the same street, and sort of, and be a flag, like a standard for a more wholesome and traditional way of life, somewhere where you can practice it without being molested by either the state or by the institutions of, of government, of local council, whatever. In the same way that, again, I'm using like a bit of a meta historical analogy here, but when West Rome fell to the Goths and the Vandals, like in the latter part of the 5th century, a lot of people think, oh, like Rome fell in the Dark Ages happened. No, Roman civilization continued in Constantinople for another, 1100 years or so. In fact, Constantinople arguably became a greater city than what old Rome was. And there was this flourishing of a civilization. It had to relocate, but it continued and it fought on, with considerable success for many centuries. And in much in the same way that when the British Empire reached its zenith, it established these colonies. And after losing the 13 colonies in the Revolutionary War, really Australia truly became the greatest exponent of British civilization abroad. And if we look at ourselves within our own country, maybe we have to plant the flag of the greatest exemplification of Australian culture and society, but in our own community, like at the local level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have to agree with this because in my experience with dealing with people in regional communities, you have these people there who are quite exceptional. They do 4 or 5 different roles within the community, and there is a real lack of those kinds of people in a lot of these communities, and you have a lot of skills and leadership gaps, which can be filled by, competent people in the cities moving out, lawyers, doctors, engineers, like you're saying. And there
is even, all of that.
Yeah. And there's a lot, and even for people who are politically minded, it's a lot easier of a path to make it into these positions of influence over society in these smaller regional towns than in Sydney or Melbourne, where everyone there is trying to one up on the ladder of society.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is too is that one of the things I think that, I think between the three of us and probably most people listening can agree that the mainstream parties are hopeless at serving what is genuinely our best interest in the wholesome, traditional, patriotic sense. And that, I don't know how much you guys delve into political theory necessarily, or what your own opinions are. Again, I'm a guest here, so I'm kind of learning what you guys know as well. But I do think that this idea of the illusion of choice and the idea of like an inner party and an outer party, and in most Western countries, and again, very specifically endemic to the Anglosphere, you have in America the Republicans and Democrats, in Britain you have Labour and the Tories, and then there's like the obvious third-party protest vote that isn't a protest vote, which is the Lib Dems, but no one takes them seriously and they don't matter anyway. And to some degree in Australia, we kind of have a few examples of that, the right-wing pressure valve is One Nation. The left-wing pressure valve is the Greens. And then, there's obviously, we have Liberal and Labor here, and none of them serve the purpose or serve the best interests of Australian citizens. Like, we know that, right? And really, people seeing through politics and to some degree transcending politics would be helpful, in that you exercise your rights as best as you can as an individual, and if you're in a community of like-minded people, you exercise it at the community level, but really accepting that there are no political solutions in this regard, and that politicians and government do not bring about solution, certainly not in the modern context, and certainly not whilst they adhere to liberal and progressive values. Because ultimately, those liberal and progressive values are antithetical to Western civilization. And if I may just give yourself, or maybe not yourselves, but certainly your listeners, a sort of a grain of thought to ponder on. Whenever you're watching this, our what we could call an excuse for right-wing media in Australia, which is Sky News, right? When people say defending our liberal Western democracy, let me just say this, and I say this from the standpoint of someone who's studied and read a lot of history, and it's sort of my thing on Twitter and YouTube, is that in Australia, we've been a federation since 1901, right? And the states were self-governing colonies before then. Britain has had, you could argue the Parliament was really empowered at the end of the Revolutionary War, like in the 1790s, 1780s, 1790s. And very much the stature of the king, or in the case of Queen Victoria, started to become diminished after Victoria, and certainly progressively lost power as World War I and World War II took place. It could be feasibly said, though, that the atrophy of the British monarchy started under Cromwell, and the execution, essentially the first domestic execution of a king, as did happen under Cromwell. So the British history is a little bit more, how can I say it? There's more endurance to that story. But it's still a constitutional monarchy in essence, right? It's not like, technically a fully fledged democracy or republic. The USA has been, ever since, I can't remember when it was actually, obviously the war took place in 1776, but like whenever the founding fathers eventually constituted America and Washington became the first president, I can't remember the year, but that's been the United States for sort of 200 or so years. But most of our civilization isn't liberal nor democratic. One could argue that the greatest zenith of the Spanish Empire occurs as a Spanish monarchy. I mean, I say this as someone of Italian stock. Latin Italic civilization reached its zenith during the Roman Empire under under the period of the five good emperors. You're talking like Hadrian, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Antonius Pius. And one could say that the greatest Roman that ever lived was probably either Augustus or Julius Caesar. And that takes you back to literally before the birth of Christ. This is a long time ago. And the Roman Empire is an entity. If you think Augustus being the first emperor, it becomes an empire, sort of around the time of the birth of Jesus. And if you take the longest possible measurement of Rome to being 1461, which is when the Turks capture the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire, nearly 10 years after the fall of Constantinople. I mean, that's the continual existence of an empire for 1,500 years. Germany only really became, aside from this small Weimar period between World War I and World War II, or between World War I and when the NSDAP took power in 1933, and with the Enabling Act, the painter became, the Reichsfuhrer, essentially. Germany's only been a democracy since 1948, I think, when the Allies sort of allowed Germany to re-exist again, or certainly West Germany. But Germany had always been either a kingdom or a series of kingdoms, and then the Holy Roman Empire. France was a kingdom up until the French Revolution. It had been a kingdom from prior to Charlemagne to when they beheaded Louis, and storming the Bastille, in 1790, whenever it was. The vast majority of Western civilization is neither liberal nor democratic. And this thing that they do is kind of like this mind trick that they play. They want you to sort of reinforce belief in their system, a system that is faulty, a system that, completely dismisses natural law, a system which completely, persistently lies about the essence of humanity and human civilization. And it teaches us this at the level of kindergarten and primary school, where most shit, sorry, I don't mean to curse, but our soft liberal progressive school teachers embed this narrative in us at an early age. You really have to be cognizant of it. So, yeah.
No, thank you. I think that was a really good explanation of the social and ideological drivers of the broader changes. And you did articulate why it is such a negative thing for this outmigration from the regions to the cities, to the cosmopolitan culture that persists in the cities, and the destructive influence that's having. Maybe we can drill a little bit down, though, into some of the more specific movements that are changing things. I'd say we can have a look at the environmental movement. Now, I'm not going to litigate here whether climate change is human-caused and as detrimental as it is advertised to be, because Australia is such a minor factor in contributing to that it really doesn't matter. What is causing a huge impact is the result of the climate change-driven and motivated policies on regular Australians, especially on farmers. This is something that is unfolding all across the Western world. And I just want to ask you, Furious, is this something that you have encountered in your own field, and is it something that people you know are facing down? Is it a serious impediment to the development of the regions?
Me specifically, not yet. I think it so happens just the nature of Australian agriculture. We're under less pressures. I definitely think the greater or the more obvious examples of this is, say, we all witnessed but essentially what was a farmers' revolt in the Netherlands in the last, that's been sort of on and off in the last 18 months or so, where the government and actually there is a comparison. We can circle back to live export, because obviously in Perth they had a rally, just last week or two about it. But it's this idea or this notion that people in positions of power and the bureaucrats and sort of their apparatchiks, their sort of ideological enforcers and foot soldiers, right? Who never pay a penalty for being wrong, right? They never pay a penalty for imposing misery on people simply because of. And when I use the class, I don't want to express that in a leftist sense. I mean that insofar that if you consider that after they got rid of the aristocrats, because I actually want to get to Revolution Russia before we end the stream, if we can. But in the same way that basically once the Bolsheviks dispensed with the aristocracy, the first actual class of people they went after were kulaks, Russian farmers. And they went on them on the basis that they were landowning and independent, and they were essentially a class who, not perhaps entirely, but for the most part, shared a worldview, shared a belief, shared some kind of philosophical and religious outlook on life, which made them an enemy to the revolution, which is why they had to be liquidated. And I don't use that word lightly. The kulaks, the ones who did not escape, or the ones who did not grovel before, the Red Army, were liquidated. And that is actually why in places like France, in places like, the USA, in Canada, and there were contingents that came to Australia who escaped the Bolsheviks from the Donbass, from Kazakhstan, from Circassia, from southern and western Russia, what we even call White Russia, which is like towards Belarus, which is like the most agricultural part of the country. They had to flee because as a class they were destroyed by essentially a revolutionary ideology and their apparatchiks and their enforcers, which in Soviet Russia were the NKVD. Now, a lot more soft power and a lot less hard power is used in the modern West because they have to sort of at least offer lip service to their own liberal progressive nonsense, right? This great lie that they, that is the center point of their narrative. But say, for example, going back to the Netherlands, I can't remember what the number was exactly, but I believe the government basically signed an agreement, like some kind of climate agreement, that they would reduce nitrogen fertilizers by 45% within 5 years. That would destroy the Dutch agricultural industry. Netherlands is a tiny, tiny country. I think the Netherlands might be maybe as big as Victoria, like possibly, maybe slightly larger, maybe slightly smaller. I don't even know. But it's a tiny, tiny country. The Netherlands and Belgium are sort of sandwiched between France and Germany, right? They're very small countries, and they're highly efficient. They're very good at what they do for what they have in terms of resources and surface area and land. They're very adept farmers at their style of farming, right? And the government just signs this unilateral agreement and then imposes it on this class of people. The politicians never have to account for it. The politicians don't have to in any way suffer material consequences or suffer as a result of the imposition of this. The government, the politicians will still pay their own wages. They'll still do what politicians do and take money from, from any kind of donors and whatever. I know the American system's more endemic for this, but you know what I mean. Like there's always slush money in politics wherever you go, right? And politicians will always have vested interests one way or another. But they'll impose this on an industry, and in the case of agriculture, a class of people whom, for the most part, they see as hostile to a liberal progressive agenda. And, well, hell or high water, farmers are going to adapt, or farmers will have to leave. And just to address, you guys started this segment talking about Clarkson. I mean, there must be a portion of this. This is just where people are willfully stupid, or rather, are incidentally stupid. But there's a certain proportion of this that is completely willful and malevolent, where people who don't like agriculturalists, don't like farmers, don't like the class that they are as people, don't like their beliefs, don't like the fact that they are, at least in the modern context, a somewhat self-sufficient population group. They pay farmers in Britain to retire them off their land, so that then that land can be sold to developers so they can prop up housing to take in the last influx of migrants that have come in the last month or two. That productive land is then lost forever. And particularly somewhere like Britain, right, where, between the feudal system and the enclosures and, Britain being the center point of the agricultural revolution, this is land that has been curated and managed for literal centuries, by people who have been handed down knowledge from father to son, father to son, father to son for, possibly dozens of generations, and that possess countless, priceless knowledge, which is also true in Australia, although our environment and climate is obviously different. But it's this idea that you have this accumulated knowledge that you then lose. And these people have an attachment to that land, and they form the basis of community and of a social structure that belong to a place. This is the monumental tragedy of this. If you really peel away the layers, you start to realize how malevolent this is. And the great, the thing that vexes me and that causes me, I mean, I'm a person of a fairly stoic constitution, but what gets my ire somewhat is that there are talking heads who, bloviate and make a fuss, and like the Paul Murray's was like, oh, well, I'm fed up, and we're talking common sense and whatever. But this is stuff that actually needs to be unpeeled and unraveled and explained to the Australian people, and needs to be sort of repeated. Australians need to know what is happening to them and why, and if they want out of it, what the solutions could possibly be. I hear none of that in the media, and anybody who's a talking head who touches this subject with a feather are complicit, because there are people, for example, who engage in this in the Australian media, who probably should or do know better, who don't explain it for fear of blowback or for fear of touching a nerve. And when you are governed, or you are under the auspices of cowards, as sadly a lot of Australians are, the way out is very difficult.
Yeah, that's I absolutely agree, and I think maybe we can narrow down a little bit who exactly some of the perpetrators of these attacks, I think we can describe them, against our agricultural class might be. For example, we can have a look at massive international corporations such as BlackRock, which has been buying up a lot of farmland as of recent. We can also look at how a large portion of Australia's agricultural water, which is usually used for irrigating land, is actually foreign owned by other massive conglomerates from America, China, and various other places all across the world. In fact, they can trade this water, own and trade this water free of capital gains tax, because technically this water doesn't count as property according to some convoluted loophole in the Australian tax code. This is something that Australian farmers cannot actually exploit. Water on farms is still counted as part of that is taxable. However, if you're an international owner, this is not. And something to the tune of $150 million worth of water is actually what is owned overseas. Something like 14 to 15% of our agricultural water. This is something that is completely cold. It's something that is completely mechanistic. It's not the way that farming is pictured in old MacDonald's, nursery rhyme books that we read when we were growing up. This is something.
E-I-E-I-O,
Yeah, these are massive, cold, heartless corporations which are only concerned with the dollars and cents at the bottom of the line. They are, and they actually have no concern for these generations of accumulated knowledge that you're describing here, Furious. And they don't care about Australian culture or tradition at all. At the end of the day, these can be trampled without any concern, and they absolutely have the power to do so. There's an incentive for the politicians to permit this scheme to keep going because, of course, it supposedly bolsters the economy, the national economy, as well as the local economy, while locals actually see none of the benefit of it. And so these are some of the more specific culprits. Maybe I could get you to speak a little bit on this. Do you see this as a massive issue? Do you see this as something that needs to be rectified, or am I completely misreading the situation?
I mean, put it this way, I have some knowledge of this insofar that where my family, because I've sort of got family spread over basically from rural Queensland, from beyond Brisbane to the southwest of WA. So I've sort of had a bit of experience here and there, depending on where, some relatives in Victoria, I've kind of had a little bit of a taste of everything, but I myself and my own immediate family have not been, thank goodness, party to having suffered the consequences of this particular thing. But what I can say is that I've seen, and I've read countless articles that have touched on, the sale of prime Australian farmland, prime Australian station country, being parcelled off and sold to foreign nationals. And the fact that the government permits this is actually horrible. Because in the end, it's a surrendering of your sovereignty, of your agrarian food production sovereignty to foreigners. And then in the case of what you're saying, with the water allocation, which, in the end in Australia is mainly a reference to Griffith, the Murray-Darling, the sort of that countries through southern Queensland, western New South Wales and into parts of South Australia, which is where this policy mostly pertains to. It's again, rather than it being a community issue whereby water is fairly and equitably within reason distributed to farmers depending on supply, on need, on geography, location, whatever. I mean, we could probably have a whole nother conversation about the freaking Bradfield scheme, but we won't get into that. But needless to say, maybe if we have time at the end, because I do have a couple of examples from antiquity of public works being built to the benefit of people, which our governments refuse to do. But anyway, there isn't enough money to create this sort of self-sustaining, or at least a regenerative circumstance for people who need these resources. Because in the end, the old adage is true: you can make money from mud, you cannot make money from dust. Water is the lifeblood of a civilization. It's the lifeblood of any kind of settlement or city, which is, and I say this as an Italian, much of the Italian countryside is littered with aqueducts because the Romans were obsessed with water. And it's kind of a particular area of interest for me, because I've often been at meetings, even with my dad, and kind of, being black and blue in the face, saying oh, well, if they can do this in ancient times, why can't this ditch go 30 kilometers in this direction? What's the impediment? Which kind of answers to some degree the point that you made about Greens policy and just, general kind of laws pertaining to what farmers can and can't do, and all the approvals that you need to, and all the hoops you need to jump through, and getting all the, you have to submit plans, and you have to submit, all this paperwork, and then people who live in a city, who are, half obese, sitting in their office chair, who have, never had dirt under their fingernails, are deciding your fate on your behalf. This is the kind of thing that just infuriates me, because the system is ass backwards, right? But it really is. It is a tragedy when, particularly a country like Australia, which, because of our marginal conditions, because of the difficulty and the lay of this land, we have arguably produced the greatest cadre in terms of at an economic and a sort of like a socio-cultural level, arguably one of the greatest sort of cadre of farmers on the planet in history. And I don't say that lightly. You got to think to make money out of, you go to like cotton country, say like on the border there between New South Wales and Queensland there. You're talking like once you go past the wine country there in South Australia, you look at parts of WA like along the rabbit-proof fence. The vast majority of farmers can't cut it, but Aussie farmers make a go of it, and they make a damn good go of it, and they've been making a good go of it for a very long time. And they've done it with relative degrees of success. And like I said, compared to, say, parts of Europe and certain parts of America, with not much help. What do Australians get? A diesel subsidy. That's about it. That's the crumbs off Canberra's table that they sort of flick in our direction whilst they, thumb their nose at us. That's the little bit of a leg up that we get. But if you sell your farm, the ATO will take half of your clearing sale. They'll rub their hands with delight when your parents or grandparents decide to sell up shop, and then all the capital gains they rake in. You've paid tax on your own income, you've paid the taxes on the wages for your workers, and you've paid this sales tax and that sales tax. I can't remember if it was JFK or Reagan, but like farmers are the only people who in a market that buy everything at retail, they sell everything at wholesale and have to make up the difference. And this is especially true in Australia, even compared to America. And ultimately, those dollars add up, and they add up over weeks and months and years, and in some instances, generations. And there's not really a strong knowledge of this, sadly, beyond the country areas, and the fact that it's met with indifference by our elites is actually the most damning thing of all. And so, but going back to like the Greens things briefly, is that again, these are, even compared to say the Liberals and Labor, they laugh at being environmentalists and all this quibble, but that's just a skin suit for basically being radical leftists, right? They are for all intents and purposes, Bolsheviks wearing a green skin suit, more or less. And sort of liberals when I say liberals, I mean like ideological liberals, not the Liberal Party, just to make a distinction. They're progressives of the worst kind, I suppose, is a better way to put it. And they never pay a consequence for these sort of things. That they'll introduce ideas and policies that impact farmers and just not so much as bat an eyelid. Just to touch on WA just for the moment, because obviously we had the Keep the Sheep protest here a couple of weeks ago, in WA. And, the live export thing has just been a political handball. And I say to people who are perceptive to this, it's like the fact that an industry's arterial vein of survival can be this political handball for various political parties and politicians is a nonsense. They can somehow, not to make this a discussion about social policy, but somehow gay marriage can be enshrined in law, but they can basically ban live export and then enshrine that in law, and then an entire strata of the society and the economy are economically strangled because of the whim of political radicals and their activists and their enablers in the realm of academia and in journalism and whatever. And again, this isn't strongly articulated. Again, there's kind of like this like reflexive, huff puff from Sky News and the Murdoch press. What's the phrase I'm looking for? Giving lip service to farmers and agriculturalists, like, oh, this is nonsense and yada yada yada. But explain it. Say that leftists consider agriculturalists ideological enemies. Say that the Labor Party are diametrically opposed to the success of farmers and the industries which are associated with farming, that they resent you. Well, we're all in this together and we got to stop being divided, is a cope and it's a lie. In the end, Carl Schmitt got it right. politics is the distinction between friend and enemy. And one of the beefs, if you are a right-wing person, you should have a liberalism, is that it actually lies to you about the nature of politics and human relations. For instance, well, we talk about flooding and like the weather patterns and stuff, right? You know, with Queensland and whatever. And it's like, oh, there's never enough money for dams and we can't expand Ivanhoe and yada, 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 right? And we're meant to be a liberal democracy and everything's meant to be good and proper, yeah? Like, we all understand that notion.
Yes, makes sense.
When the Romans, well, rather when Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, built Constantinople, and I implore anyone who's been to Constantinople or who's visited Istanbul or wants to visit Istanbul, does a tour and sees this thing. Under the city, there's something called the Basilica Cistern, right? And the Basilica Cistern is essentially and the reason it's called the Basilica is because the internal of it almost resembles the inside of a cathedral. Not a church, a cathedral, right? Now, this thing is 138 meters by 65 meters in terms of its size, which calculates to about just under 1,000 square meters, like 9,800, something like that, right, in terms of its area. It holds 80,000 cubic meters of water, right, which is about 2.8 million cubic feet of water. And it was designed so that if put under siege, Constantinople could nourish its 500,000 population, and it got as high as 700,000 at some point in its history for 2 years at a minimum, right, with rationing. And old Rome could be fed with 11 aqueducts. They had a collective length of around 800 kilometers, and they could move anywhere from a million cubic meters of water a day, and some figures say around 600 or 700, right, to support a population of anywhere from like 1.5 million to 2 million people in and around Rome, right? These are grand projects that were done, through the late Republic and into the imperial era, by the nasty, disgusting, authoritarian emperors. And our enlightened, good, democratic politician representative elites can't expand a dam. They can't help us, ensure our survival going forward. They can't build public works which are to the benefit of our people. And in fact, only bring in policies that happen to be of detriment to us. And I think people need to see that for what it is essentially how I wanted to close this off. And that's why I wanted to reference the aqueducts and stuff, because you got to think, that's not small fry. That's a lot of labor. That's a lot of material. Like, anyone who travels to Italy or Greece or Turkey and you see these things, they're huge.
Yeah, I'll touch on that slightly. Just in my experience dealing with state governments across Australia, it's not that they can't, it's more that they won't.
Yeah, precisely.
There's a complete aversion to increasing the amount of weirs or increasing the water storage capacities in these regional communities for this grand, this environmental agenda or whatever you want to call it. And they just let the water run off into the ocean. Bish, bash, bosh, don't care about it.
Or they evaporate, and who cares,
Yeah.
And this
yeah, you go, sorry.
Just very quickly, it's just like, I'm just saying this because I've seen like adverts about this, because you got to think we're like heading into winter now in Australia. And it's always, like, oh, now it's the time, you got to turn your reticulation off. And then summer comes around, it's like, oh, you got to, you can only, have your reticulation on this day, this day, this day. And there are limits, and there is this, and there is that. And they make the little person feel so bad about just, wanting to live in a nice, scenario, in a nice sort of personal circumstance, right? That, they've got to pull the purse strings. They've got to tighten their belts. It's never politicians who decide to take a voluntary pay cut. It's never them who might, sell a fleet vehicle, or them who might take 1 or 2 less flights a year. No. It's the little guy who's got to, who's got to wear their underpants for 2 or 3 days in a row, and it's such a disgusting inversion. I hate to use a leftist term, but it's sort of like, in essence, that's sort of, it's gaslighting and it's projection of the political elite and the academic and journalistic elites on us. And there has to come a point where people like us just say, no, actually, you're talking nonsense, you're lying, and it's actually you who are doing this to us, not the other way around. And I think the water situation is a great example of that. The other thing, they pay millions of dollars on advertising boards to tell us about how we need to manage this affair, and we don't even decide it. Like that's the great, the you know, the shameless part about this all. Anyway, I've spoken plenty, so I'll let you boys finish things off. But I did want to end on that note, so thank you for allowing me to do so.
No, absolutely.
No worries.
Thanks for joining us and sharing all of that. We'll definitely have to have you on to maybe discuss some of the solutions to this. I did like earlier on in the podcast, you spoke a little bit about the idea of rejuvenating towns with people who are ideologically aligned with us three, moving out there and bringing their families with them. That's certainly something that could work on the small scale, but perhaps we could look at things on a broader governmental scale. We can discuss the Bradfield scheme and some various other ideas. But I think for today, this has been a great episode. We diagnosed a lot of the problems. We got down to the nitty gritty, and we'll definitely have to have you back again in the future, Furious. Thank you very much for joining us.
I would love to, and it's been a pleasure, Jones, and you've been very gracious. I apologise for my horrid connection just there at the end, but and indeed, thank you to your listeners. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I know sometimes I can go into little monologues and just go into streams of rant, on and on. But no, thank you. I very much enjoyed it. You guys are fabulous, and I would love to come again. So I'm very pleased and I'm very grateful. So cheers, and for everyone who's listening, enjoy the rest of your evening or day. Thank you.
Just quickly before you go, where can the audience find more of your stuff, more of your content, Furious, if they want to hear more of your monologues?
Sure. more of my monologues. That sounds about right. I have my Twitter account, so it's just the handle is at FuriusPertinax. They just happen to be two of my favorite Romans, and I've pushed their names together. I can always answer that question another time in more detail. And I don't actually have technically my own content per se, but I'm a co-host on, if you go to YouTube and you search Apostolic Majesty, we've done like a number of other sort of sporadic streams about various historical topics, but we have a couple of playlists. I did mention them earlier, the Nations of Charlemagne and the Orthodoxy, Autocracy, Nationalism, and they are two streams about two very comprehensive aspects of human history. I also tend to stream with a gentleman called the Academic Agent, who does, I think, 3 weekly shows on YouTube every week, and I sometimes appear on them as a guest. I've also done some other stuff as well. Maybe John, I can send it to you, because I actually have on a couple of separate channels address these kind of questions regarding agriculture, the economics of it, sovereignty, farming as a class, that sort of stuff. I have touched on this stuff before, and there is more of my opinions and descriptions out there, so I can send them to you on DM, and you might be able to share them onwards.
Yeah, they'll all be linked in the descriptions. Yeah, people will be able to find them.
That's mostly where I'll be found. So yeah, at FuriusPertinax is basically, if you happen to have Twitter, that's where much of my rambling is. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for coming on. Come back anytime. Your long rambles makes it easier for John and I to do an episode.
Yep, and
you're too gracious, guys. Week. Thank you.
Quickly, Matthew, where can everyone find our content? Rattle it off.
YouTube, Spotify, Apple playlists, Apple Podcasts, Substack.co. Yeah.
Substack. Yeah, the Substack is thenationalobserver.co. Everyone should go check it out. That's where you can find all of our contents, all compiled together in one neat website. You can subscribe to get it emailed straight to your inbox. That's it. Have a great rest of your week, guys.